This week about three friends who went hunting. A doctor, a lawyer, and a preacher. Before long, while they were hunting, a buck came out into the clearing. All three friends took their rifles, and at the exact same time, each one took a shot, and the deer went down. They went over to it. They began to have an intense conversation about whose bullet actually took down the animal. It got a little tense, a little heated. Now, a forest ranger happened to be walking by, and he overheard the conversation. He went over to the deer, he looked at the deer, and without hesitation, he said, "It's the preacher's deer." They asked him how in the world he figured that out so quickly. He said, "It's easy. Look where the bullet went. It went in one ear and out the other." I've heard that can happen at church. There's a wealth of themes and potential sermons in chapter 17 of the story. The chapter pulls together chronologically passages from 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel. It was suggested at our staff meeting this week that an interesting series after this series formally ends would be to go back and fill in some of the big holes that we've missed along the way. There's certainly, particularly in this chapter, but in many of them, are passages that are worthy of note and worthy of even series of sermons. I'd love to spend more time today focusing on Ezekiel, his visions, more time on some of the bright spots of the chapter, like Josiah's reforms. But the truth is, the overwhelming tone of this chapter is not bright. There is hope, for sure. But this is a difficult chapter with strong notes of warning, of the reality of sin, of failure, of judgment, and punishment. We hear those notes sounded in many places, but I'd like to focus on the prophetic message this morning, the prophetic message of Jeremiah. Jeremiah's prophetic ministry spanned a period of about 40 years. From 626 BC, during Josiah's reign, during his reforms, until the fall of Jerusalem, or a period just after, around 587 BC. He prophesied through the reign of the last five kings: Josiah, Jehoiahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah, all except Josiah, who did evil in the eyes of the Lord. We got used to reading that, didn't we, after many of the kings are described. The New Bible Dictionary reminds us that Jeremiah grew up in a pious priestly home. He would have been taught the law. He would have been taught about his faith. As a child, he likely would have heard about and even grieved with his family the moral corruption, the religious persecution that was happening when he was a child under King Manasseh and his son Amon. Jeremiah's call to be a prophet through this difficult time was not an easy call. He was essentially told by God that his prophecy, his warning, would go in the people's ear and right out the other side. But they wouldn't listen. Jeremiah 7:27. When you tell them all of this, they will not listen. When you call to them, they will not answer. Here's what I want you to do, Jeremiah, and by the way, nobody's going to listen to a word you say. Generally, when you commit to a task or commit to a job, you like to think that there's going to be some result, and that's part of your commitment. I was trying to think what it would have been like a few years back when the pulpit committee interviewed me for being part of ministry here, if they had opened with, we'd like to welcome you to Birch Cove, and by the way, no one's going to listen to a word you say. Now, let's leave that. Authorship of the book of Lamentations is sometimes debated, but it has traditionally been attributed to Jeremiah during and after the fall of Jerusalem. If it is Jeremiah writing, you get some insight into the anguish that was a part of his calling. He is sometimes, as I mentioned to the kids, he's sometimes called the weeping prophet. There are words of hope in Lamentation, chapter 3, verses 22 and 23. It says, "Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions, they never fail. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness." Words that we sing in a hymn. We'll sing a little bit later on. And words that I'm sure have been etched and written on many posters and plaques that hang on walls in homes. Great is your faithfulness. Your mercies are new every morning. But the verses just before those are interesting, and I suspect won't be found on too many plaques or posters. Verses 10 to 15 of chapter 3 in Lamentations. "Like a bear lying in wait, like a lion in hiding, he dragged me from the path and mangled me and left me without hope." Who would Jeremiah be talking about there? Guesses? Talking about God. Talking about God. He dragged me from the path and mangled me. He left me without hope. He drew his bow and made me the target for his arrows. He pierced my heart with arrows from his quiver. I became a laughingstock to all my people. They mocked me in song all day long. He's filled me with bitter herbs and given me gall to drink. He's broken my teeth with gravel. He's trampled me in the dust. I've been deprived of peace. I've forgotten what prosperity is. So I say my splendor is gone, all that I'd hoped for from the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I will remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. How many of you have that on a poster in your living room? Not going to happen. These are hard words. But they come from a man of faith who stayed faithful to his call to live, to stand, and to speak for God in a society and in a generation that had turned from God to worship idols, gods of their own creation. And when I read this and hear his heart and his experience, I come under conviction. John, will you stand for me, even when it's hard? Even when it feels like I'm piercing your heart or trampling you in the dust. Following me, John, is not about feel-good verses on your wall or soothing songs on your iPod. Yes, there are blessings. Yes, there is peace. Yes, there is comfort in Christ. Yes, the hope we have through Jesus is full and final, but God reminds us here that standing for him in a corrupt pagan culture, living for him in a culture like ours, living for Jesus, where we may feel mocked or ridiculed, is sometimes not an easy call. And sometimes it hurts. Some of you know that. There are times when it doesn't seem to make sense, and we can't see the plan, and I'm sure there were many of those times for Jeremiah. But ultimately, Jeremiah knew, and he would speak these words from God to his people later. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." Jeremiah teaches us, as some of you in your small groups saw this morning and even through this past week, that success is not results. Success in God's plan is what? Faithfulness. Success is not results. Results may come. Blessings may come. But God looks at the heart. Success in God's scheme, in God's plan, in God's heart is faithfulness. People stay faithful. Let's stay faithful to God. Let's make him central in our lives. Let's worship him. I don't know if you're going to remember this sermon, but I know all of you are going to remember Eli. Right? All the time. Worship him all the time. Stand for me. Speak for me. Stay faithful to the calling that you have. God has a calling on my life. God has a calling on your life. And sometimes it goes well and it feels great. Wind in the sails, but sometimes it feels like there's a hole in the boat and you're sinking. Stay faithful to God and his call upon your life. This was God's call to Jeremiah. And the day today is different. It's not 7th century BC. It's 2019. We don't live in Jerusalem. We live in Halifax. But the call to worship the one true and living God is still the same. The call to stand faithful is still the same. Will you stand with me for Jesus? Will you stand with me? Some of the idol names have changed, but the gods being served are all around us and are daily asking us to worship them. Will you turn from them with me? When God shows us this has become too central in your life, too important to you, will you turn them and replace him? Replace those things with Jesus on the throne. Jeremiah compared the idols of his day to cisterns. It's not sisters, cisterns. Listen again, Jeremiah 2, 11 to 13. Has a nation ever changed its gods? Yet they are not gods at all. But my people have exchanged their glorious God for worthless idols. Be appalled at this, you heavens. Shudder with horror, declares the Lord. My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. A cistern, of course, was a reservoir dug or built to contain water, rainwater. And they were needed, and still are in many parts of the world, in climates that are so dry much of the time. God says through Jeremiah that these idols that you are worshiping can't hold water. They're like broken cisterns. They can't satisfy. They can't give you the nourishment for life that God intends for you. Ultimately, they run dry. Have any of you found that? Some of us have spent a lot of time digging cisterns. Wasted some time. And cisterns that ultimately don't satisfy, that run dry. But I, says God, am like a spring of living water that won't go dry, that will satisfy, that will give life. And you discovered that? The sin and idolatry of God's people brought horrible destruction. Horrible destruction. For Jerusalem itself, for so many of the people of Jerusalem, so many killed, so many brought into captivity. And their sin was no laughing matter to God. And I think that's a lesson for us too, to consider the seriousness of sin, the seriousness of idolatry. All sin is idolatry. Their sin was no laughing matter. Did you hear that in the passage I just read? Be appalled at this. God calls out to the heavens. Be appalled at what you're seeing here with God's people. Shudder in horror. Idolatry and sin matter to God. And it's not to be winked at. It's not just a religious word to inspire guilt and followers in the church. Sin is real. Not to be winked at, not to be taken lightly. And the consequences of unrepentant sin were and are great in life and in eternity. And so we're called today to turn from worthless idols. It's been a regular call, hasn't it, in the Old Testament, in these passages. We're called today again to turn from worthless idols, confessing our sin. We're called to stop building cisterns, wasting time, making things that don't hold water, that don't satisfy, central in our lives. Breaking down those cisterns, and turning to the one who gives living water. There is hope. There was a coming hope for God and for his people, and that's hinted at in this chapter. The story will lead us there, clearly. God would be faithful to his people. God's covenant promise to David would be fulfilled. There was reason for Jeremiah to say, because of the Lord's great love, we're not consumed. His compassions never fail. Great is thy faithfulness. One little picture into what's coming. The Gospel of John, chapter 4. So he came to a town in Samaria. So Jesus came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into the town to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "But you're a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews did not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well's deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I will give them will never be thirsty. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up into eternal life." God is good. His mercies never fail. He's faithful. Even when we can't see it, even when it's hard, even as our lives pass away, God is faithful. And he has eternal plans for his people. I invite you, each one of you this morning, to reaffirm your commitment to worship the one true and living God, to drink deeply from the living water that comes from God, even Jesus Christ, his Son. Turn from the broken cisterns that we've dug and turn in faith to Jesus, who alone forgives, who alone gives life and eternal life. And let's stand for him, even when it's hard, even when we can't see the whole plan. Let's trust our God. "I know the plans I have for you," God says to us, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, and to give you hope and a future. He has that for each one of us. Amen? Amen. Great is thy faithfulness. Why don't we sing it together? Would you stand with me and let's worship God as we sing.